Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's graphics card performance comparison. Today we are testing 4 different graphics cards. The RX 570 4GB card against the GTX 1060 3GB card, the RX 580 8GB card against the GTX 1060 6GB card. Now these cards range in price from about $170 to about $250 when I'm filming this in 2017. There will be links in the video description below to both Amazon and Newegg for all 4 sets of graphics cards. By all means, compare prices and buy it where it makes the most sense to you. All 4 cards were installed in the same computer. It's my $1,500 i7 7700K build running at a fixed 4.7 GHz on all 4 cores. Link to that build video in the video description below. Fraps was used for the frame performance numbers you will see at the end of this video, but it was not used to capture any of this video. Instead, AMD's Relive and NVIDIA's Shadowplay were used to record the gameplay you're watching. Add 5% on average if you're not recording, but if you're live streaming or recording, this is exactly the performance you can expect to get. Finally, the numbers in green at the top left corner of the screen are from MSI Afterburner, a free program you can download and use to monitor your system's performance in real time while playing games. This is a very handy tool to figure out what is the limitation to your system's performance. Is it your CPU, your RAM, your graphics card? I use this all the time, and if you want to find out what the bottleneck or limit in your system is, I recommend you do so as well. First up, we have the RX 570 4GB card. Now, all of these tests were run at 1440p resolution at ultra detail. At 1080p detail, you'll be well over 100 frames per second on all these cards. At 4K resolution, you'd have to turn the detail down a bit to maintain a playable frame rate. These cards will play Overwatch at 4K, but you may very well have to end up at medium detail and possibly lower the render resolution to perhaps 75% in order to get a good frame rate at 4K. Honestly, for 4K, these cards really aren't my primary recommendation. They'll do it, but 1440p is kind of the sweet spot if you play World of Tanks, World of Warships, Rocket League, Overwatch, Dota 2, those kind of games. These 4 graphics cards will do very, very well at 1440p resolution. If you look at the real-time numbers in the upper left-hand corner, take a look at the first line, the RX 570 line. The first percentage you see there, that's the usage of the compute power of our graphics card. We are graphics card limited here, not CPU limited. So while I have an i7 7700K, and frankly it's a bit of an overkill CPU for a game like Overwatch, it at least removes CPU performance as a limitation. That being said, Overwatch would play just fine on any of the i5 or Ryzen 5 processors as well. You don't need an i7 for this. It helps in other types of games that I'll test on these cards, but Overwatch doesn't really care. The specific RX 570 that I'm testing here is the Mini ITX 1-fan Sapphire card. This is a very inexpensive basic card that will fit into many machines. It will fit into most pre-built machines, Dells, Acers, HPs, Lenovo's, etc., because it's short, it doesn't take up a lot of space. The downside is it's one of the slowest RX 570s on the market. If you look at its clock speed, you'll see that we're running at just under 1150 megahertz. This is actually downclocked a bit. Take a look at the temperature of the card at 70 degrees Celsius. Now I have the fan set to auto. If you manually turn the fan up, this card will run faster at the cost of noise. At this current fan speed at about 1500 RPM, the noise is virtually non-existent. It's very quiet. If you turn the fan speed up to 60 to 70%, the clock speed will end up in the 1250 megahertz range and you'll get a few more frames per second. But if you do that, the fan spins over 2000 RPM and it becomes noticeably audible. If you want higher clock speed, you'll need a 2-fan card. And the 2-fan cards, which I have tested, will comfortably run in the 1250 to 1300 megahertz range and do have better performance, but they don't fit into more basic pre-built and smaller ITX and mini ATX cases. So if you have more room, get a bigger card. That being said, if you're going to get a bigger card, buy the RX 580 because they only cost a little bit more and they perform 10 to 15% faster than the RX 570 does for a very small amount of money. When I'm recording this in April of 2017, a good factory overclocked RX 570, such as the Asus Republic of Gamers Strix card, is $190. Prices change all the time. That's why these are linked in the video description below. But it's $190. That card will comfortably run at 1300 megahertz on the clock speed of the chip and 1750 megahertz on the RAM. It's a great card. However, for $10 more, you can buy an RX 580 4GB card. And those cards will run at 1340 megahertz as a base with 2000 megahertz as the base RAM clock speed. Those cards are faster for $10 more. Frankly, an RX 570 for $190 makes no sense. Now, this card here I'm testing is not $190. This I actually paid $170 for. Even that being said, I still think it's too much. The RX 570s are a deal in the $150 price range, in my opinion. I do think they'll get there relatively quickly. When you're watching this video, if you find that the 570s are in the $150 price range, that would be a deal. But for $170 to $190 with the RX 580s at $200, the 580 really is a better deal. Of course, that being said, for another $20 to $30 above that, you can get the 8 gig version of the 580, and I think in the long run, that's an even better deal. But of course, now the price is starting to creep up. $220, $230 for an 8 gig 580 versus $170 for a 4 gig 570. It's a personal choice as to what games you want to play and what your budget is. But I do believe that between the 570 and the 580 at the current prices in April of 2017, the 8 gig 580 for $220 to $230 is the deal. But when you can get the 4 gig 570 for $150, that will become a reasonable deal for the price if you're on a budget. Now, having said that, I talked right through the transition to the GTX 1060, and here we are looking at the 3GB version. Now, this specific card is the MSI Gaming X 3GB card. If you look at the clock speed at the top of the screen, you'll see it's at 1936 megahertz. This is the auto overclocking GPU Boost 3.0 speed. This is not the advertised clock speed. Even the boost speed is not this high. However, the NVIDIA 10 series cards auto overclock themselves based upon thermals and temperatures. This card will overclock further. I did not manually overclock it for any of these tests, but I can tell you from experience, this card will easily run at 2000 megahertz. In MSI Afterburner, all you have to do is on the GPU clock, simply type a plus 65 in there. Put a plus 65 in there, it'll raise this to 2000 megahertz, it runs just fine. Look at the temperature and look at the fan speed. The MSI Gaming X has 2 huge fans and a massive heatsink and cooler on this thing. The fan's only turning at 800 RPM. That's half the speed of the previous card. Now it has 2 fans, so that helps, but it's running very cool, and these fans would easily spin up to 40-45%. You still would not hear this card. That is still silent, and it would run all day long at 2000 megahertz. Now, why am I not doing that for this test? Because I'm running these cards out of the box as you'll get them. Most people are not going to download and install MSI Afterburner and manually overclock their cards. So I'm showing you the out of the box experience. The GTX cards overclock nicely, another 65 to 100 megahertz. It depends a little bit on your card. When you get beyond 2000 megahertz on the 10 series, you do start having to maybe bump the voltage a bit, bump the power delivery and temperature allowances a little bit. But 2000 is a nice, safe number. Every one of my 1060 and 1070 cards, without exception, has successfully run at 2000 without complaint. Very few of them will get to 2100. Usually somewhere in the 2050 range is where they fail. And so I just take 2000 as a safe number because they've all run perfectly without any voltage adjustments or other tweaks. Take a look at line 2, 3 gigabytes of VRAM. We're using 2 gigabytes of it. Overwatch at ultra detail at 1440p absolutely does not need more than 3 gigs of VRAM. So while we have a 3 gig, 4 gig, 6 gig, and 8 gig VRAM card in this test, the VRAM is irrelevant. One common misconception some people have is, well, if I buy a card with more VRAM, that makes it faster, right? Somehow it uses that RAM to play the games faster? No. What your VRAM is primarily used for is storing the textures that games use in order to draw everything on the screen. The walls, those columns, the character models, faces, all of those are overlaid with essentially textures, bitmaps, images that create the beauty of the world. Otherwise, it would just be a polygon wireframe world. The VRAM is used for other things too. It does store things besides just textures, but textures take up the bulk of the space. Switching between medium, high, and ultra textures is usually what causes VRAM use to go up. Even if you are VRAM limited, even in future games 2 or 3 years from now, if you are VRAM limited, you can usually set games to a higher default preset and set them to high, set them to even ultra, but go into the texture detail and turn texture detail down by a notch, and you'll notice that your VRAM usage changes dramatically. Most other settings will not change your VRAM usage nearly as much as the texture detail setting will. Come all the way down to the bottom line and you'll see our real-time frame rate. We are comfortably over 80 frames per second. Now, some people like to say, well, I'm playing an online competitive game like Overwatch. I want 120 or 150 frames per second. Maybe you have a 144 hertz monitor and you want 144 frames per second. Fair enough. Well, either play at 1080p, turn the detail down, or buy more graphics card. I would like to point something out when it comes to competitive games such as Overwatch. I looked this up recently. Overwatch has a server tick rate of 63 hertz. The server updates the position and information of everything going on in the game 63 times per second. Even if you are running the game at 144 frames per second, your enemy's positions and the data on what's going on in the game doesn't update that fast. It's only going to update 63 times per second, no matter how fast your client runs locally. Now, it is true from an input lag latency point of view, from a responsiveness. If you have a high refresh rate screen, if you have a high frame rate, you certainly can perform a little bit better in these types of games. Just keep in mind that if the server is not updating the position of the enemies more often than 63 times per second, then what you're responding to on the screen is not going to be as precise as even your computer is updating. High refresh rates are nice, but don't get carried away thinking that online multiplayer games are updating the information on the screen from the server's point of view as quickly as your computer can draw the pretty pictures on the screen. So, something to keep in mind. Now we're running on the RX 580 with 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Now these cards start in the $220 to $230 range. This, however, is a top-of-the-line Gigabyte Aurorus factory overclocked card running at 1425 megahertz. This is one of the best RX 580s you can buy. It is a more expensive card. It does tend to cost in the $160 to $170 range, depending upon where you buy. But for that money, you do get a faster card that is very, very quiet. You get other things besides just clock speed when you buy factory overclocked cards. In this case, you get very large fans that make less noise than some of the smaller cards. The base level cards have smaller diameter fans and smaller heat sinks, so the fans have to turn faster, which makes more noise. These are large oversized fans, and this thing comes with a truly monstrous heatsink. In fact, this card is actually thicker than a standard 2-slot cooler. So if you want to put 2 of these in Crossfire, which by the way I don't recommend because it's not supported by enough games, but if you wanted to, keep in mind that this actually creeps beyond the width of 2 cards. But in return, you get one of the fastest out-of-the-box RX 580s on the market and one of the quietest. Now, keep in mind that if you take the price of this card and divide it by the clock speed or the frames per second it gives you, and then you take the $220 cards and divide those by the clock speed and the performance they give you, this is actually not the deal. The deal are the base cards. In terms of dollars per frame given, this is spending extra money for a relatively smaller percentage of performance. The deal here is for the larger fans, greater potential additional overclocking, and perhaps also other features such as RGB lighting, which this card has and the $220 cards don't. If those kind of things are important to you, those are non-performance reasons to buy a card such as this. It is a very nice card. I will be doing a review of this separately coming up on my channel soon, but what I will say is that performance-wise, the difference between 1425 megahertz and the 1340 base speed of the RX 580 is less than you'd think. We're talking about 3 or 4 frames per second on average. If you're playing, we're currently at 86, 87 frames per second. Great, so it's 87 frames per second instead of 82 frames per second. Is that worth spending an extra $40 for the card? No, not really. If that was the only difference, then this wouldn't even be worth looking at. The reason to look at this is larger fans, larger heatsink, potentially better overclocking beyond this speed, the RGB lighting, and just because you think it looks cool. I do want to call your attention to line 4 of the MSI Afterburner numbers, main system RAM use. Now, in prior game performance videos, I've talked extensively about how important I think 16 gigabytes of RAM is today in 2017 for game machines. I stand by that advice 100%. I've tested and played a lot of different games. However, there's an exception to every rule. Games like Overwatch, League of Legends, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, World of Tanks are the exception to that rule. This game would play absolutely perfectly in 8 gigabytes of RAM. It's not the sort of game that needs 16. Ghost Recon Wildlands, The Division, Grand Theft Auto 5, Battlefield 1, those games need 16 gigs of RAM. Not that they won't run in 8, they will, but they run smoother in 16. Not faster, smoother. Now, as a side note, there will be timestamps linked in the video description below. If you want to skip to the GTX 1060 6GB card, you'll find the timestamp down there. Just click on it and it will fast forward the video to that point. However, this was an epic battle and a nail biter, and I really want to leave the whole thing in there because this was really cool. So I'm going to keep talking and let this play out because this was pretty epic. It was a nail biter. This right here is the kind of game I wish all Overwatch games were. Right down to the finish, back and forth, competitive, both teams have a chance. One of my complaints with online multiplayer games is too often they're blowouts. One side just roll stomps the other and there's no contest. And this is not an Overwatch problem. This is a matchmaking online game problem. World of Tanks, World of Warships, League of Legends, Overwatch, they all have this problem. One team just obliterates the other team. I love nail biters. It's fun when there's a challenge and either side can win. Sometimes you win those, sometimes you lose those, but at least you feel like there's a chance, like the teams are, it comes down to skill, and you could win if you just get the right combination of characters and moves. But it's when it's like 100-0 and it's just a ridiculous blowout. Well, that's pointless. I mean, that's just, experts beating up on amateurs. And sometimes that's me. When I play World of Tanks sometimes, we'll destroy 2 tanks and the other team wipes out our whole team in 3 minutes. That shouldn't be fun for either side, quite frankly. And don't misunderstand me. I've been on both sides of that. I've certainly been in, for example, Battlefield 1 matches where we won 1,000 to 250 or 1,000 to 300, and the enemy team just had no chance. Oh, great. So we win and we get some points. There's no challenge there. You might as well be playing the bots in the computer for all the difference it makes. And of course, I've been on the losing side, and that's no fun either because it's like, well, why are we even trying since we're just getting obliterated? And I walk out in 2 seconds, you're killed because they're experts, and quite frankly, well, I'm not. Well, I don't want this to become a complaint about online gaming because I do in fact play them. In fact, World of Warships is one of my current go-to favorite games. I have entirely too much fun with that game. But I like the pace of World of Warships. Absolutely, you can be killed in the first minute or two, especially if you're, unlucky or, just stupid and give the broadside of your cruiser to a battleship and he has nobody to shoot at but you. And I've been guilty of that, to be sure, and mostly I chastise myself for being stupid by giving the broadside of my cruiser to a battleship. But at least there's a little bit of strategy and elements. You can sail around, you can position yourself and think ahead and plan ahead. Sometimes games give you no chance to strategize. Maybe I'm more of a thinking player. That just might be my personal play style. I like Overwatch, but I don't play Overwatch a lot beyond benchmarking simply because there's not a lot of strategy unless you're playing with friends. Now, I could see how this would be unbelievably awesome if you were together with 3 or 4 friends and you guys were all in TeamSpeak or some type of voice chat and you were working together with the right mix of teammates. You got a healer, you got a tank, you got DPS. This game would be epic. And frankly, it's entirely possible that some of the blowouts that I've experienced on both sides, winning and losing, some of the teammates may very well have been in groups talking via voice. There's no way random people generally can compete against skilled players who are in a group. I've played a lot of Star Wars The Old Republic. And in Star Wars The Old Republic, we have both PvP Warzone matches as well as raids and operations with 8 and 16 people. I have done both in voice chat with guilds. Now, I'm not currently an active member of a guild because I don't really play Star Wars The Old Republic anymore. But when I was active with it, especially back in the 2.0 and the 3.0 era a few years ago, I was a member of a very active guild. We had a weekly raid schedule. We had weekly Warzone and PvP schedules. We'd get on TeamSpeak. And those are epic. When you've got one person running the group in voice chat, there's just nothing like it. It is totally awesome. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that epic fight. It was a nail-biter. We were in overtime right to the end. They were dying, we were dying. That's exactly the kind of match that I love and live for. Those are so much fun. Now, here we are on the GTX 1060 6GB card. This is a very, very nice EVGA for the win dual fan card. I want to call your attention to the clock speed up at the top, which is a bit faster than the MSI Gaming X out of the box. This will also overclock faster if you set it faster in gaming in MSI Afterburner. Look at the fan speed, very slow. This thing is completely silent. Now, it is worth noting that the temperature on this card is higher than on the Gaming X. Why? Because the fans are a little bit smaller and the heatsink is much smaller. The For the Win is the same height as the PCI Express slot. If you don't have a very thick case, this card will fit better. The Gaming X is a very tall card in addition to being a very long card. And it's worth noting that with a smaller heatsink, the temperature is higher. So while it's very quiet, it does run higher. And if you want a silent, cool running card, well, bigger heat sinks. As a side note, I decided to leave it in there. Notice I was killed there. I was going to get coffee when the match started. Shame on me for doing that. That's what happened there, by the way. VRAM usage, 2 gigabytes. Main system RAM usage, 6 gigabytes. Frame rate, 80 to 100 frames per second. This performs perfectly. Right now in 2017, in April, when I'm recording this video, the 6GB GTX 1060s cost about the same price as the 8GB RX 580s. Which one should you buy? That's a personal choice. They are, as much as it doesn't make a difference, about the same. Performance-wise, they trade places. Some games the 1060 is faster, some games the 580 is faster. It just depends upon which game you're playing, but it's rarely more than a 5 to 10% difference one way or another between the two cards. It just comes down to personal preference. Which drivers do you prefer? Which company do you prefer? Which company makes the cards or the cooler design that you prefer? Which one you can find the best deal on the day that you watch the video or the day you decide to go buy. That's why I link to the full lists of the 580s and 1060s down in the video description below. Check the prices when you're ready to buy. If you find either card for $20 or $30 less than the other one, if there's a sale or a deal or a mail-in rebate, and you don't really have a strong preference, buy that one. Performance-wise, you'll never notice the difference. They're both very nice cards. It really comes down to just personal preference and price. You get the idea. Let's go take a look at the results. Overwatch 1440p, we have a very smooth progression in performance. This game is very consistent. The RX 570 4GB card had an average of 78 frames per second. That steps up to 83 on the 6GB 1060, 88 on the 8GB 580, and 99 frames per second average on the 1060 6GB card. But average frame rates are only one part of the equation. In this video series, I'm doing something new, 1% minimums and 0.1% minimums. What do these numbers mean, you ask? To put it simply, look at the red bars first. 59 frames per second on the 570, 63 on the 1063 gig, 68, and then 79 on the 6 gig 1060. What this is the 1% minimum. This means you will get at least this frame rate 99% of the time. So 1% of the frames were below this number. 1% is a fairly small number. It's occasional hitches and stutters. It's not something you're going to notice a lot. So basically, the vast majority of the time, you'll get at least this frame rate. Green is the average, red is the 1%. So what's the 0.1%? This is the frame rate you'll get 99.9% of the time. This number, in my opinion, is not the most important number on here. The red bars are. Why? Because in a 10-minute run at 60 frames per second, the 0.1% minimum represents just 1 second or 60 frames worth over 10 minutes of gameplay. That is a trivial number. The 1% number represents 10 seconds worth of frames or 600 frames across 10 minutes of gameplay. I don't consider 60 frames out of 60,000 to be a huge deal, but I do include the 0.1% minimums because, well, generating them isn't that hard. It's easy to put in the chart. Some people want to see them, and since frankly everybody else is including them, people would wonder why I'm not including them, so here they are. But my advice to you is to focus on the 1% minimums, the red bars, more than anything else. That's what you're going to get 99% of the time. 59,400 frames out of 60,000 frames are going to be at least that performance. The blue bars are 59,940 frames, which is frankly all of them. Now, it's very easy to get carried away with benchmark charts, and if you did fast forward to this section and skip some of the commentary, then you missed the point of watching the live gameplay. Benchmark charts are just numbers. It's easy to look at them and go, well, clearly the 1066 gig card is the winner, so we must buy that one. Really? Okay, fair enough. But please note that both the RX 580 and the GTX 1060 maintain over 60 frames per second on all the performance metrics, average, 1%, and even the 0.1%. So they're all perfect for 60 frame per second gaming. Again, Overwatch has a 63 Hz tick rate on the server, so these cards are going to be perfection when it comes to online playing, unless you just absolutely have to have 144 frames per second. Do not discount the less expensive cards, however. Frankly, their 1% minimums mean that if you have a 60 Hz 1440p monitor, those cards at ultra detail will play Overwatch beautifully, and you frankly would never notice the difference unless you're testing them back to back. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge red button directly below the video. Questions and comments below the video, and remember to check out the video description. Links to everything here will be down there. Amazon and Newegg will be down there, as well as the link to my full playlist on the i7 7700K machine. Furthermore, my Patreon link will be down there. Do you like this video? Do you like my gameplay and analysis? If you found this useful and helpful and you want to see more of it, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Every single dollar from Patreon goes back into the channel to make more videos, to keep me independent so I can keep bringing you unbiased information such as videos like this. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video.